In this talk, I'm going to tell you a series of urban animal stories from Birmingham. After narrating these stories, I offer a brief recent history of the second city. Ultimately, I'm offering a provocation to listeners that we must learn how to better live in and fight for urban multi-species communities. 1. The badger. In 2011, I moved to Birmingham in the Midlands of England to begin my undergraduate degree. During my first year in the city, I spent a lot of time smoking outside the front door of my student flat, based on a student village a few miles south of Birmingham city centre. As I spent days, weeks and months trying to survive a lonely year in a new city, surrounded by people I didn't belong with, there was one person I could rely on, an urban badger. My flat was in a small block up a hill that bordered on a thick patch of trees and shrubbery. It was from this thicket that the badger would emerge and to which they would return. Badgers are incredibly secretive, eluding especially those who seek them. The only badgers that I had met before moving to Birmingham were in the shape of roadkill, despite badger populations being far higher in rural areas. Urban badger populations are thought to be relics that have survived urban encroachment. Badgers have a reputation, and this badger had a particularly strong one. Many of my peers were terrified of them, others taunted them, and most were totally oblivious. That summer, flat doors were propped open, getting air into the stuffy flats. On multiple occasions, people arrived home to find the badger curled up asleep in open doorways, having to cautiously step over them or wake them up to shoo them out. The badger welcomed me to a city I was otherwise alone in, a city that was changing quickly around me, but I didn't know that yet. At the end of that year, I moved a few miles away, but I never forgot about the badger. 2. The fox. In 2017, I moved into a flat near the high street of Birmingham city centre. I was in the second year of my PhD and commuting to London for fieldwork. I spent most of my time on a train, in an archive, or asleep. But some of my time was still spent in that old solace, smoking outside my front door and staring into space. The landscape outside of my door now was quite different to the one I had shared with the badger. My flat faced a row of bars, restaurants, and an electronics shop. This road was never quiet. During the day, streams of people flowed from trains arriving at New Street Station to their offices. Evening brought drinkers and people coming to eat, and weekends brought streams of shoppers. It was a busy road in the very centre of the city, but the bars there had a midnight curfew. My favourite time here was at around 3 a.m, when the quiet settled in for a few hours until dawn. Sometimes I would go outside in these early hours and stand on the street. The city is not designed for me to feel safe, and often I didn't. There was a bench outside of my flat that I would sit on. If I felt unsafe, I'd stand in the deep doorway of my block, propping the door slightly open with my foot. It was one of these early mornings that I met the fox. The street was quiet but bright with artificial lights, as well as the station's beaming external eye-shaped screen beaming on me. Over the road, I heard a scuffling. From an alley darted a fox. Clearly not expecting to encounter a human, they stop and we stare at each other across the road. A minute or so passes with me stilled in surprise to see a fox, the fox staring back, surprised to see a human. The fox broke the moment and slinked off up the road and away. I never saw them again, but this encounter opened the gateway to another city, the one that all other animals live in. 3. The heron. Between the city centre and the university, there is a stretch of canal which has a path on one side and trees, shrubs, grasses, flowers on the other, cordoned off from gardens and roads by high metal fences. Walking home along the canal in autumn 2019, I saw a heron. They were so close that I could see the water slide off their waxy feathers. Crouched down, their neck was low to the ground. I'd walked these canals for years, but I'd never seen a heron before. Maybe they hadn't wanted to be seen, or maybe something had changed. A few weeks later, I saw a different heron, almost blue-grey and much smaller. I stop and crouch on the opposite bank of the canal. The heron is partially hidden by reeds, standing just in front of what I know is a fox den. The canal cuts between us. There's something clumsy about the heron, even though everything about them should be elegant. Their stretched legs, long necks, and beautiful shades of white, blue, and grey. The canals are a place for city-dwelling animals to hunt, play and sleep. While the city centre is dangerous, the urban edges are fertile playgrounds. The herons interrupted my path across the city. I fall quiet, hoping for a momentary glimpse into their world, trying not to disturb them even after they have seen me. The first heron I met was on the path I was walking. I stopped about 10 metres away and squatted down. The heron saw me, eyeballed me, and fell still too. Our urban lives, as yet separated, were connected through a momentary portal. While these city canals are beautiful and bursting with life, they are also eerie and full of potential dangers. We become prey so easily on these canals. They are unlit, often isolated, and walking the canals was never, for me, totally without fear, but the presence of herons in my slowed urban navigations invited me to experience the city differently. As I walked the canal paths that run parallel with the cross-city train line, my world felt a million miles from the overcrowded commuter trains, although they were only a few feet away. 4. The eucalyptus tree. In the garden of my house in 2020 was a beautiful eucalyptus tree. In the year when the buildings we loved to live in became our whole worlds, this tree offered shelter through its indulgent and healing shade. From the bedroom I worked in, I would often watch squirrels chase one another, a pigeon perched on a branch that they were too heavy for, and tits, starlings, and robins visit the bird feeder. 2 neighbourhood cats would visit me daily, sitting with me in the garden or watching me plant potatoes. At the foot of the eucalyptus tree was a quince plant, and towards the end of the garden, a blackberry bush. One Saturday in late February, a friend and I planted a bed of gladioli. Through pandemic isolation and loneliness, my sanctuary was found under the eucalyptus tree, watching the garden grow, shoot, and eventually die. In November, the man who owned the house next door knocked on the front door to tell us he had decided to cut down our eucalyptus tree. My heart dropped. After painful weeks of fighting, it was eventually agreed that the tree would only be trimmed. For anyone who knows anything about landlords and terrible neighbours, you might guess what happened next. The neighbour turns up at my door and says, "We're coming in now to cut the tree down. Your landlord said I could." Explaining I wouldn't allow access and not to cut the tree down, I closed the door. 30 minutes later, I look out the window to see 3 men in my garden, hacking down the eucalyptus tree. The neighbour had taken down the fence separating our gardens and allowed these men in to kill the tree, and with it, my urban sanctuary and the urban sanctuary of those other animals. After this, when I looked out of the garden, all I could see was the remains of a tree representing my inability to protect what I love simply because I cannot afford to own it. The birds, squirrels and cats rarely visited anymore, and the quince began to die. 5. The parakeets. In 2020, the pandemic had destroyed my human networks in Birmingham, dispersed friends across the world, and left me isolated and relying on the beyond human world for connection. I continued walking in Birmingham, straying further from my home as restrictions eased. Before I left the city, I was determined to meet a group of animals who I had heard of but never seen, the urban parakeets. I knew that the parakeets were often spotted in Highbury Park in South Birmingham, about 40 minutes walk from my house, so I regularly trekked there on long lunch breaks and evenings. I didn't see them once. In January 2021, I had just 6 weeks left to live in the city. One grey and drizzly weekday morning, I forced myself out for another lockdown walk. I was wearing cream trousers and new walking boots, Christmas present. Walking towards Highbury Park, something pulled me in another direction, towards another park called Cannon Hill. As I walked there, spurred on by my new walking boots promising a dry passage, I decided to turn right into Holders Lane Woods, a strip of woodland that runs along the playing fields just south of the park. I rarely turned this way because it's thick with mud, but as I said, the new walking boots had solved that problem. Then I heard them, the unmistakable quick chattering and cheep, cheep, cheep song, recordings of which I'd listened to so many times so that I would recognise it when I found them. In the woods, I stop ankle deep in mud and look up at the bare trees. The branches are filled with beautiful green parakeets. Their long-tailed silhouette vibrant against a pale grey sky. I stand there for a long time, listening, watching, mourning. My trousers were ruined. I visited the parakeets regularly over my last few weeks in Birmingham, sitting quietly with them and thinking about the city, how much has changed, how much I will miss it here. The other Birmingham. A few weeks before I moved to Birmingham in 2011, there had been riots in the city following the killing of Mark Duggan by officers of the Metropolitan Police Service. The riots were, according to Sparlek, Exacti and Davies' account, a space where only those who had no business and no invitation to use the spaces around the city's consumer hubs were marching to the beat of the rioters' drum. The riots, as well as a mourning and a resistance, were a reclamation of power in the city, an outpouring of resistance to regeneration centred around consumption. The two stories that populated my first year in Birmingham were this loud explosion of riots and resistance, and a near silent badger negotiating the outskirts of the city, mostly unheard. Cities have been built on this exploitation of non-human lives, but they are also offering increasingly viable new ecologies. Urban animals have been categorised by Van Doren and Rose into two categories: those who choose to move into city spaces and animals who find themselves overtaken or displaced by cities. Watching the fox by the bins, I feel as if I have entered another realm of the city, one temporally displaced from our all too human urban lives. I assume he was looking for food. One human's trash is another fox's treasure. After meeting the fox by the bins, the boundaries of the city had moved, demanding I ask who is welcomed and who is forced out, and how non-human life is erased from urban stories. What are we losing as our cities wipe out and regulate non-human life? Birmingham's chaotic development has, through successive regeneration efforts, centred around big city centre projects. Birmingham's main train station, New Street, and attached shopping mall were regenerated in the early 2010s, opening as Grand Central in 2015. The construction company's tagline was transforming one of Britain's worst stations into one of its best. This most recent iteration of regeneration also involved bulldozing the Central Library, pictured here, a brutalist landmark designed by John Madden, and replacing it with a three-tiered postmodern cake that turned an anchor of city life into a gimmick. Birmingham city centre is sprawling, and under the big city's plan, it is getting larger, with plans to expand the city by approximately 5 times. As Birmingham sprawls, it encroaches on and displaces human and non-human urban residents. Walking across the city via canals connected me to the animals living beside me, who were totally absent and forced out of an ever-expanding and regenerated city centre. Walking became a deliberate political act to slow time and expand space in the city, and in doing so, to invite encounters with other urban residents, like the herons. Birmingham has recently seen a huge influx of private investment and wealthy professionals, displacing poorer communities. The encroachment of the neoliberal city is not contained to architectures and infrastructures. It defines the working lives of the precarious classes, seeping into our lives, homes, and bodies. Human and non-human urban residents' lives and spaces are in the hands of the elites. Our tree was the victim of this urban story. Birmingham has become a project onto which neoliberal ideals and failures are writ large, into which speculative capital flows and life empties. While large-scale narratives of the human city play out, urban animals continue to carve out space for themselves in the shadows, borders, and at the very heart of the city, even as they are invisibilized from large urban narratives. As the city encroaches on more than human and human worlds, some humans find themselves in a shared precarity with urban non-human animal residents. For the precarious human class, our interspecies relationships are stifled by the dictation of our lives through, for example, landlordism and constant demands to move out and move on. The neoliberal regeneration of Birmingham's development has, both architecturally and spiritually, entrenched the ideology of atomised citizens. In telling the story of Birmingham over the last 10 years for encounters with non-human urban residents, the hauntings of another way of life, a convivial, shared, more than human urban politics, are there, but barely visible. Are they almost lost forever?